We know nothing about the things that we know the most about. Every major religion and mystic tradition says that the truth is hidden inside of paradox. This is since we're too closely attached to the things that happen close to us, and thus it is exceptionally difficult to be unbiased. At the same time, we can't see the end result of what these events mean. A Chinese communist premier, when asked what the result of the French Revolution was, replied that it was too early for us to say. Most people view it as a triumph of science and industry, in which the average person was rid from poverty and ignorance, however unfortunately punctuated by hateful conflicts that were leftovers from the older age. The world became more rational and enlightened, leaving behind the dark pre-industrial world of religion, racism, empires, and oppression. The real story is very, very different from this. The 20th century was the century of the most rife religious conflict in human history by a vast margin. It was a battle between three separate religions, which fought to the bitter end. It was also the century of the most academic lying and pseudoscience ever. The 20th century will be better remembered as the century of pseudoscience than real science. On top of this, this conflict is still being fought out today, with the final stages of the humanist wars of religion occurring now. Buckle up for a ride that will completely change your view of modern times. At the start of the 20th century, the whole world was changing at an incredibly rapid speed. In 1900, you could see cavalry and sabers on the battlefield, and 50 years later, there were nuclear weapons and tanks. The Industrial Revolution was reworking civilization, and an individual person's daily life changed in almost every way it possibly could. The world's population doubled between 1800 and 1900, and has more than quadrupled in the time since 1900. The world's rich in irony. For humanity as a species, this was the best period ever. The number of humans skyrocketed to levels no one could have possibly imagined before, while their actual lives became much safer, easier, and prosperous. However, at the same time, individual humans and countries, or whole regions of the world, lived through some of the worst periods ever in human history. The horrors of the Holocaust, Stalinism, Maoism, or the trenches of World War I are things that previous generations could not even have dreamt up in their nightmares and border upon hell on earth. The rapid changes inherent to industrialization and globalization broke collective understandings of the world, which created what amounted to giant mental health pandemics, those being totalitarian ideologies. This ironically occurred right after humans got rid of actual pandemics on a large scale. There is a very good book named The True Believer by Eric Hoffer. It was written in the 40s and talked about the psychology that leads to totalitarian movements. Hoffer describes a freedom from freedom. We humans need psychological stability in a terrifying world. This comes from religions, communities, families, ethnic identities, and other forms of group identity which we can rely on when our own mortality as individuals is too terrifying. When the world's too much, people follow radical political ideologies to give their lives some direction, meaning, as well as shared community with shared values. With the breakdown of the old social world, which did not just occur in industrial countries, but also in what we now call the developing world due to colonialism, we saw large populations who lost any religion or other social forms to give them meaning in life, as well as the destruction of traditional village communities and family structures. It resulted in people fleeing into what really amounted to as cults. Cults have existed since the dawn of human history. They were often pretty powerful as well, with the cult of Mithras, the Gnostics, Freemasons, and others being some examples. However, they were largely elite minority organizations which controlled society through indirect influence. By cult, I mean an organization with a set hierarchy, rituals to enter through which, and common ideological goals built around shared beliefs, with the leaders benefiting disproportionately. The National Socialist and Communist Party of China fit all the definitions of a cult. However, at this point, the cult takes over the whole society. You can tell a good religion from a bad religion, based as it sounds, since the first has abstract moral standards that it can hold itself to, while the latter self-servingly adjusts its moral code to whatever its self-interest is at that given time. Also, a good religion is capable of establishing boundaries for what it is and is not capable of doing, while a false religion claims that it will fix everything at no cost to the follower. You're not being spiritually conned if your religion tells you that your life is going to be hard, but if you learn to humble yourself, it can be a bit more bearable. A false religion tells you that there is hidden truth that suddenly has been revealed, and when all agree to that hidden truth, we'll live in a utopia. An important part of this is that for all these ideologies, as people join them to sublimate their anxieties around life, and that doesn't actually happen, that ideologies spread to try to control every aspect of human life due to their obsession with power. A good ideology is capable of seeing beauty and truth in the world. A false one only sees through power and sees the only thing stopping it from reaching a utopia is its lack of complete power over everything. In the early 20th century, or a period of unbridled growth, it had appeared as if humans had conquered nature and were close to breaking the code that would allow us to live in a utopia. All three of these ideologies follow something called the technological project, or the idea that by using technological progress and social engineering, the human race can reach a utopia. Remember this point since it's going to become the most important thing for the end of this video. The world in 1913 was largely the same that it existed at the Congress of Vienna 100 years before when Napoleon was defeated. It was a world with large European colonial empires. Almost every state in the world was a monarchy, or very recently a monarchy, or run by the aristocracy. Farming was still done largely with hoes and plows, and almost everyone would be what we would call a religious fanatic today. The historian Niall Ferguson makes an interesting point that if you traveled around the world 100 years ago, and you just look at what people wore, it would be incredibly diverse between the cowboys of the Old West, the shawls of Eastern Europe, how Breton peasants dressed, the Chinese top knot or Indian saris. Now all their great-grandkids are wearing t-shirts. Things were only the same right on the surface. Beneath it, as said before, the world was coming to grips with colonialism and industrialization. Lenin liked to say history either happened glacially slow or like lightning, that there are hours in which decades worth of history take place. And if anyone in history would know that, Lenin would. Our current era is one of those moments in history in which decades of history have built up and now will be spent in the next couple years. World War I was very similar. Western civilization had spent 1,000 years building up the nation's honor, religion, and cultural foundations to get young men to happily die in the hellish trenches of World War I. At the end of the war, everyone stood both literally and metaphorically shell-shocked, completely unable to deal with the world they grew up with as children no longer existing. Every single country that lost World War I saw a regime change and the collapse of liberalism. Starting in the 1920s, we saw the ideological scramble for people who tried to explain the horrifying traumatic suffering that the whole world faced through either World War I or communism. This process also occurred in the developing world as colonialism had wiped out all of the previous cultural trajectories. Starting in the 1920s, we saw the ideological scramble of people who were trying to explain the horrifying traumatic suffering that the whole world was facing either through World War I or communism. The battle for the hearts of the world had begun. Three ideologies came out to fight over the world for the century after World War I, those being liberalism, Marxism, and fascism. Liberalism was the only one of these ideologies that was in power before World War I, and was partially invalidated by being blamed for the war. Sort of like a video game, we'll talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each major ideology, which thus help determine the end outcome. In my video on family structure, I explained how you can use family structures to accurately predict what kind of ideology societies went for in the 20th century. This is since families imprint what intuitively seems fair in a culture, since people grew up with it. As the peasants gained political power, they tried to replicate their families through politics. The exogamous clan, with countries like Russia, China, Cuba, or Yugoslavia, went for communism. The patrilineal family, with nations like Spain, Germany, or Japan, went for fascism. The nuclear family, with the English speakers and the French as examples, stayed liberal. Modernity struggles massively with tunnel vision, or ability to see context. The way our logical systems work is that we say reality is the things we can scientifically prove, and if you can't scientifically prove it, it just doesn't exist. However, then we only research the things we want to think about. This is all how these ideologies propound what is really pseudoscience. At the same time, the modern world looks for a single principle, whether freedom, race, or class, and tries to explain all human relations through it, which has to fail since the world is infinitely complicated. An example of this kind of logic is our views on race or gender today. The literal argument for a gender spectrum, or why men or women don't have differences between them, is that first, there are cultural expectations around gender, thus gender is a cultural construct. Cultural constructs don't exist since we made them up, and thus gender doesn't exist either. The same argument's used for race. I've taken a full course of gender studies, and I've read thousands of pages on this topic, and you can reference James Lindsay if you want to know more. However, this argument that everything is a cultural construct, thus cultural constructs don't exist, has literally been used by postmodernists to say that reality doesn't exist, and we can edit reality for whatever we want, which is insane. This is such a weak argument since it's so easy to find mountains of evidence irrefutably proving the differences, mentally or physically, between men and women in many different ways. Although you can argue at how much it affects things like intelligence or personality, there is no one in the sciences of any political position who argues that biological race is not a real thing today. However, for decades, since these topics were taboo to study, we just refused to look into them, thus meaning people could say they didn't exist, even though every era of history thought it was completely obvious that they existed before. This is how every side of the political compass has gone through a phase of saying that its values are the scientific truth, since it just researches things that validate their pre-existing assumptions, thus resulting in science becoming a mirror for its beliefs. In his book The Master and His Emissary, McGhilchrist talks about how neurologically these ideologies are dependent upon the left brain, which are incapable of seeing the world through any lens except power, and see no truth, love, meaning, or beauty. Also, its views are incorrect against the right brain when tested, which does all of the things above. But the left brain is always completely confident in its worldview, while the right brain is capable of seeing nuance in its own failures. In summary, the left brain is a worldview without meaning, purpose, beauty, truth, love, and everything else that can't be autistically mechanically proven. The left brain is a worldview in which the only things that are assessed are money and power. One of the things McGhilchrist says, and this is incredibly true of our time today, is that the left brain is simultaneously incredibly cynical because it doesn't believe in anything except money and power, but it's also incredibly gullible because it's incapable of looking at context. And modern art's just a great example of that, because the artists are all like, I'm so original and perfect. And then they put out absolute garbage, and our society is so gullible we just don't call them on their bluff and say your art is terrible. In Jungian psychology, there's this idea that you need to grow out your shadow side, or the traits that you are weakest at and naturally repress, in order to be able to fully develop as a person. My dominant Jungian function is the hermit/magician, and my shadow is the explorer. Thus, to become my full version, I need to travel, take risks, go on adventures, to reach a balance with my hermit who just wants to stay at home and read. However, this is also true of ideologies. Each of these ideologies needs something else to balance themselves out. None of them ever achieved that, though, which is why all of these ideologies died. Of all these ideologies, communism is the worst constructed. I have a full video explaining this topic, however. Communism is naturally the most removed from the human condition. Communism assumes progress will always occur no matter what, that humans are naturally good, that we can socialize humans to be whatever we want, or the blank slate, that class and economics are the only lens through which history operates, that humans are equally talented, that men and women are the same, that metaphysical ideas or standards do not exist, that we are completely destined to form a giant global classless society. All of these are wrong, though. Every single one of these has been objectively proven to be incorrect. The reality is humans are inherently self-serving, unequal, religious, divided by nationality, sex, are biologically programmed by genetics, and progress or wealth are inherently rare against the historic norm of poverty and stagnation. However, understanding these 2 points show the implicit point of communism and its greatest strength, its seductiveness. Communism offers an incredibly enticing worldview for a large part of the population. It literally posits the happiest and most self-serving view of the human condition you could possibly have. It tells people if they kill the rich, the group most people hate, that they will face no struggle and live in a utopia, or heaven on earth. Communists are also incredibly effective at using language. This is partially due to how emotionally palatable communism is, but also the communists tend to recruit the wordsmiths or chattering classes in a society, like academics or artists, who are most articulate. In a war of letters or propaganda, the communists will always win. However, to rope back to the Jungian point, communism's big advantage also leads to its weakness. Communism sounds on paper, must be balanced with how brutal the reality is. Communism has been tried dozens of times in every climate, civilization, and continent over the last century, so we know this is a feature, not a bug. Since communist societies abdicate responsibility on every single social level, it naturally falls to an autocratic leader. Communists always say that the perfect conditions of real communism weren't met, but if your ideology's tried that many times and fails each time and needs absolutely perfect conditions, it's just a bad ideology because the world's never going to be perfect. We even see this in the pre-modern world, where societies that were economically communist, or those who had no market since the state ran everything, were all brutal theocratic autocracies. Examples include the Inca Empire, Ptolemaic Egypt, and partially Jesuit Paraguay. In all these cases, sharing and caring really turned to the elites treating the population as de facto slaves, whipping them to work, which is what happened in our communist societies. Communist societies can't incentivize people through money, which is what the market does. They incentivize them through force and hierarchy. Force and the market are the only two ways we've been able to incentivize people over history. The communist societies that work best are those that are theocracies with extremely strong religions, thus creating social pressures to work. Next comes liberalism. As said before, the oldest of the three main ideologies, stemming back in some form to at least the 1600s. At the time of World War I, every major country in Europe had liberalized to some degree, even Tsarist Russia or Habsburg Austria. Liberalism was widely considered to be the future. The combination of the Enlightenment, liberalism, and Christianity were seen as the trinity that would rule the world before World War I. World War I, for the longest time, looked as if it invalidated liberalism, which was fighting a defensive war for much of the rest of the century. Liberalism posits a vision of the world built off individual freedom, whether the right to own guns, property, or vote. Liberalism's great strength is its flexibility. Liberal societies see the fastest economic growth, are incredibly inventive, and have high social trust. On its face side, liberalism's strength is its looseness. Liberalism's weakness is that it isn't a religion. Communism and fascism offer broad visions of the world that promise glory or utopia. Liberalism just says, freedom's nice. This is added to the feeling prevalent among fascists and communism that liberalism is weak and decadent. Since liberalism offers no religious view of the world, which humans need, it means that liberalism cannot survive without Christianity or sometimes other traditional religions. Liberalism's an outgrowth of Christian philosophy, which prioritizes the individual soul and human agency. When Christianity goes into decline, as we'll see later in this video, liberalism morphs into something completely indistinguishable from its original position. This is, in many ways, since liberalism is an individualist ideology, while the other two are collectivist. And religions like Christianity and others establish an idea that God will take care of you. And if you have faith in God, that's what you need. But once you remove that, people get terrified and they want a collective to take care of them. And as you'll see, this is what happened with liberalism. Also, since liberalism pushes for individual freedom, if it's extended too far, it ends up eroding the entire society as it becomes atomized. And fascism and communism both maintain group cohesion through force, which liberalism cannot. The final ideology is fascism. Fascism is in some ways the opposite of communism. It's the opposite in that communism takes the more rose-tinted view of the human condition, removed from reality. Fascism, meanwhile, makes the brutal belief that life is a Darwinistic battle for survival, in which one should try to evolve to a higher level. While humans are genetically unequal, this view of the world is largely accurate, but holy shit, that's bleak. Fascism is the closest to human nature, but it's also incredibly ugly and brutal. The thing is that's completely realistic, since that's a pretty apt description of almost every pre-industrial country. Unlike communism, the fascist states had functional economies and were some of the wealthiest nations in the world, alongside fighting far above their weight class. Fascism is the most masculine, and you see problems from this in that fascist bureaucracies and militaries are often pretty incoherent because everyone is such a massive ego, and these societies push heroism and pride. For example, in Nazi Germany, each branch of the bureaucracy and military acted independently from all the others, which made a kind of crazy and inefficient system. In Imperial Japan, the military commanders would act independently from their superiors, so certain colonels would just attack foreign countries. Or military guys would assassinate politicians they didn't like, and the population was just supposed to support them because they were being very manly and heroic. In this way, communism and fascism are the opposites, because fascists had a very decentralized command structure where local commanders could disobey orders, while communism had the exact opposite, where there are stories from Soviet Russia where there's an error in the command systems which tell army units to walk into the middle of a river, and they do it even if it results in them drowning, because if they don't follow the orders exactly right, they'll all get shot. The problem with fascism is that since it keeps things so sociopathically real, it has no moral code, which makes it completely untrustworthy. When you know someone has no moral standards, they're really a threat. This is why fascism was the ideology which lost, since everyone else in the world allied against the fascist states and crushed them into the ground for being too dangerous. Fascism needs some kind of moral structure to judge itself against, or a religion. Fascism is most similar to the pre-Axial Age states like Assyria or Qin. The problem with these states and why they fell is that no one liked them since they were completely immoral, thus everyone teamed up to wipe them off the face of the earth. In the interwar period, the world became split into the liberal, Marxist, and fascist blocs. Before the war, the whole world's economy was struggling, and to deal with this, each of the ideological blocs started to use more state planning. World War II was partially informed by how the fascist states were dangerous, given they were openly aggressive, but also just by geographic position. Germany was in the middle of the map, making them the logical base for a large alliance structure against them. Japan was also surrounded by weak, entrenched powers on all sides. We all know what happened next. The liberal and communist worlds teamed up to destroy the fascist in the bloodiest war in history. They then divided it up, and afterwards came the Cold War between liberal and communist worlds. If the Nazis hadn't been fascist, or even a less racist brand of fascists, which is again a sign of how low trust fascism is, they would have easily won World War II. When the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union, lots of ethnic minorities like the Ukrainians cheered them on, but then when it became clear that the Nazis wanted to genocide them, they didn't get their support anymore, but they very easily could have raised armies in the million from Eastern Europe against the Soviets. At the same time, Jews fleeing the Axis countries gave the Allied world immense scientific breakthroughs that the Axis could have used if they weren't so anti-Semitic, and the Nazis were using tremendous amounts of their energy to kill the Jews at exactly the time of war when they needed that to fight the Russians. In short, Nazism is a big reason the Germans lost World War II. The aggression and ego attached to fascism was in many ways a dooming factor. For example, Hitler attacked Russia when he was still fighting Britain, and where it would have made sense to finish off Britain, since his racial doctrine demanded that he conquer Eastern Europe as fast as possible. The Japanese also lost World War II in part due to fascism, because if they had just kept fighting in China and then attacked Russia, while the Germans did, they would have won the war and kept their empire. However, due to ego struggles between the Navy and the Army, in which the Navy won, they attacked America instead, which blew up their entire empire. In all of these cases, the irrational, unthinking aggression that came from fascism ended up destroying their societies. Aristotle said that ideologies died through the final extension of their logic, or their greatest strength becoming their greatest weakness. In fascism, they said they would die for their honor, on their own swords in a blaze of glory. They got their wish. For communism, they said they'd kill the rich and destroy private property, which also killed them. The liberals pushed for personal freedom, which was their end. The greatest atrocity in world history was also occurring in the Marxist bloc. Somewhere downwards of 100 million people died in completely self-inflicted atrocities. The collectivism of agriculture killed 50 million people around the world by itself, since communist agriculture just didn't work. As I always say, human societies are living beings, and Marxists treat them like machines where they can just cut gears out and edit at their own free will. In the Soviet Union, for example, the centralized government killed the nobility, church, merchants, independent farmers, intellectuals, artists, most of the communist leadership, or any organization that could provide leadership independent from Stalin. Cultures can spend thousands of years building up human capital, and communists killed it all in a matter of decades. People say communists industrialized countries, and that's often true, but they did so at the cost of hollowing out their entire society. Let's look at Russia before and after communism. We have computer models that show that under the Tsars, productivity grew rapidly, while under the communists, it grew through larger inputs. If the trends under the Tsars continued, Russia could possibly be the greatest economy in the world, with a population larger than America. At the same time, before World War I, Russia was a military, cultural, intellectual titan, and after it, it was none of those. Alternately, let's compare China to every other cynic Confucian nation that went with capitalism, whether Japan, Korea, or Taiwan. However, that's comparing China after it adopted capitalism. When China was really communist, under Mao, it had a total economy smaller than Spain's. Communism was the best thing that ever happened to America, since it socially hollowed out the two countries that could have been our rivals due to technical ability and sheer size, that being Russia and China. The Cold War was in effect the process of the communists and liberals looking for allies in the post-colonial world. What happened in most cases was that military dictators of tribes tried to pretend to either be liberal or Marxist in order to get money or weapons. However, if you look at countries in Africa, some tribal groups just happen to benefit from one of those orders than the other. The proxy wars between liberal and communist worlds killed tens of millions. Communism is hands down the worst political system in history by any objective measure. As we all know, the communist world deteriorated in the last few decades of the 20th century. Since communism was a materialist ideology, once that failed, there was no justification, and the communist world self-imploded. China and Vietnam turned capitalist while the Communist Party maintained power. The former Soviet bloc deteriorated with the fall of the Soviet Empire and turned capitalist, if only crony versions. The traditional narrative goes that liberalism very clearly won the humanist wars of religion, normally since due to its inherent ideological advantages. But is that true? Are the humanist wars of religion even over, and did liberalism even win? Liberalism didn't win since it's a better ideology. I am personally a liberal, but liberalism won since the behemoth that is America happened to be liberal. This is an argument I've gotten from Azar in his masterful War in Human Civilization. The 20th century was the end of Western civilization's warring states period. We can look to the precedent of previous warring states periods which occur in every major civilization. In almost all of them, a state that we would call fascist today wins. You can see this with the Macedonians, Qin, Tsarist Russia, the Roman Empire, or the Mauryaans, all of which, if they existed today, we would define as fascist or incredibly aggressive militaristic monarchies like the Kaiser's Germany. You can see this in how fascist Germany and Japan fought far better per capita even versus liberal capitalist states. These very aggressive autocratic states were frequently able to defeat democratic ones since their obsession with war and loyalty meant that they were able to conquer them. This is one of the reasons why democracy is so rare over history, since democracies often get conquered. A profound difference between fascism and these previous autocratic states, and a big reason fascism failed while the others didn't, is that fascism was more directly racist and praised irrational aggression versus the other previous ones who praised duty and discipline more. This meant fascism alienated more potential allies and made more irrational decisions. Western civilization is the aberration, alongside with Republican Rome and kinda the Aztecs, where a democratic state unifies the civilization. In most cases, it's that the democratic state was on the edge of the map, expanded against tribal peoples, and then turned into the heart of that civilization to conquer it when it was bigger than everyone else. This is what happened with America, where due to a historical fluke, the wealthy island nation of England was able to spread its values across a whole continent without those values changing, since the Native Americans weren't able to put up much resistance, thus creating a continent-sized nation with the social institutions of a small, wealthy island country. Another thing to consider is that Russia was able to go toe-to-toe with America with the horrifically inefficient system of communism. Imagine if Russia was literally any other political ideology. We would still see a massive Eurasian bloc, let alone possibly a Russian world with America isolationist. The common wisdom goes that liberalism unanimously won the humanist wars of religion. From one perspective, this is totally true. Liberalism expanded massively as an ideology with the end of the Cold War, while fascism and communism are basically extinct. It's really dramatic that in a lot of ways, in 1970, less than a dozen countries around the world were liberal, with most of them clustered in northwestern Europe. In 2000, a majority of countries in the world were liberal, with liberalism becoming predominant in Europe, Latin America, and even making encroachments into Asia and Africa. However, from another point of view, liberalism is lost, at least in its original form. I have a theory that the ideology of the modern world is really managerialism, and is a mixing of liberalism and Marxism that bears very little resemblance to the actual liberalism of 100 years ago. It's funny where lots of people will call me a fascist for making this video, but I perfectly fit the definition of a classical liberal. On the political compass, the people calling me fascist are closer to fascism than I am. The original liberalism stood for market freedom, freedom of speech, religion, and open market without any government intervention. What's often more shocking is what liberalism tolerated. Many liberals didn't believe in democracy, saying if you gave the mob the vote, it would destroy other freedoms. Most liberals were militaristic, racist, religious, and nationalist by today's standards. What a liberal used to be would be considered far-right today. Paul Gottfried has a book that covers this in greater depth. However, when you look at what liberalism stands for today, it's government intervention into every aspect of society, massive social engineering to intervene into literally every aspect of the society, forced tolerance and multiculturalism, whether or not the public wants it, illegalizing civilian firearms, and gradually abolishing the nation and ethnicity itself. The great irony is that modern liberalism isn't just different from what it was originally. In many ways, it's the exact opposite. This video pulls very heavily from one of the greatest history books ever written, Tragedy and Hope by Carroll Quigley. Quigley, alongside the other greatest historians of the World War II era, such as William McNeil, James Burnham, or Amaury de Riencourt, all talk about this same process, which they worried would destroy Western civilization. They called it the Managerial Revolution. The Managerial Revolution has been the introduction of college-educated bureaucrats into positions of power in government and private enterprise. An easy example is how until very recently the road to success was to get a good college degree. We've seen the amount of government bureaucrats go up by a factor of over 10 over the Western world in the last 100 years. In European countries, in many cases, the population growth has been less than 1/5 of the growth in the bureaucracy. One of my friends has a great story about managerialism. He was talking to a friend who said, "You've never experienced real freedom. My ancestors founded 9 farms from Pennsylvania to Illinois in the 19th century and never signed paperwork from the government for it. You have to get the government to approve putting a mosquito fly on your back porch today." This line of logic explains how paperwork has imploded in the last few decades, how parents are too anxious to let their kids play outside, how everything has protocol. It's a process that my researcher Seamus refers to as the bureaucratization of morals. In this, the managers or experts try to get into every aspect of life so that they can use their expertise to fix it. The reality is they know nothing about how industries or spheres of life they don't deal with on a personal basis operate, and also push their class interests at every opportunity. This view wants humans to be as lazy, degenerate, or divided as possible so that the managers can manage more of their lives. It actively dislikes human agency and things done implicitly through culture, which it wants to destroy destroyed to replace with systematic procedures. The modern world is a combination of the autistic masculine and the hysterical feminine. What ended up happening with fascism's defeat is that liberalism and Marxism coalesced together while removing the elements of fascism that were connected to the basic human condition, such as the nation, honor, and the vitality of life. The similarity between liberalism and communism, which fascism left out, is this kind of scientific managerial view of the world. And with the defeat of fascism, appeals to things like intuition, passion, and genetics became totally taboo, even though those are things that we need. And we ended up in a place where we can't argue for the value of things like the nation, sex, culture, or anything else that every other era in history would view as completely obvious, because the unified factor between liberalism and communism was autistic myopia. What we should have done, and what a reasonable society would have done, is to develop a list of principles around which we should organize our society. However, because we live in a society of mechanical binary choices, people just thought the Nazis are evil. Let's be the opposite of the Nazis. But whenever you push something as far as you can, it results in silliness and evil. And we've gone too far in the other direction from the Nazis, because we have no appeal to anything else in our moral code. Fascism's basis in survival is ugly, but it's also realistic, and with its removal, our society lost any ability to appeal to national survival. Instead, to be the opposite of fascism, our cultures are committing what fundamentally amounts to suicide. This is how liberalism and communism fused. This ideology is intellectually Marxist, which is why everything is based around studying oppression today. A liberal academia would constantly be talking about how amazing the Magna Carta and American Revolution were, or praising Adam Smith, called Whiggish history. You can also tell its Marxist foundations because there's been no analysis of the errors of Marxism over the last couple decades, even though it's killed more people than any other ideology in history combined. However, through its procedures, it's liberal, encouraging individuals to do whatever they want, while telling them they have no agency and need the experts to save them. In this manner, liberalism, as it switched from being sponsored by the merchant classes to the bureaucracy, lost any connection to what it was. The through line for liberalism was a tolerance of individual action or freedom. However, this moved from freedom from things, such as freedom from an oppressive government or for certain liberties, to freedom to do things or to live whatever kind of life you want. It took liberalism's permissiveness so much so that it eroded the entire cultural foundations of society. In all great dramas, none of the people who initiated the drama survived to the end, with some random characters that show up at the end winning. This is how most Shakespeare's plays are written, as it was with the Greeks. The drama exists to show how the tragic flaw of the characters, which is always connected to their greatest strength, eventually brings them down. The humanist wars of religion, in this sense, is a perfect tragedy. One of the things I find shocking today is almost no one is proud of being a traditional liberal. The term liberal has been co-opted and become completely synonymous in America for leftist or Marxist descendant philosophy. On the American right, the vast majority will identify as Christian before anything else. You almost never hear someone appeal to traditional liberal values today. This is incredibly strange given just 20 years ago, liberalism was universally seen as the ideology that ruled the world and the future, as Francis Fukuyama talks about in his book, The End of History. Another part of the drama of life is that when one chapter of history concludes, it stops being relevant and the world is entering a completely different story. This is what has occurred today. The reason liberalism in its victory failed is fundamentally the same reason all the other humanist religions failed, that the technological project is fundamentally false. The outside world often shows the manifestations of our subconscious as we collectively build worlds modeled upon how our minds operate. Carl Jung said that the Iron Curtain was symbolic for how the modern world splits itself off from intuition, religion, and uses science for tunnel visions. Once the Iron Curtain fell, so did the other side of it. The technological project looked feasible in the era of the most rapid, insane population growth ever. Thus, there was an idea that it could go on forever and that humans had really cracked the code. The 20th century is in some ways a breath of fresh air from the rest of history, which is about cynical balance of war conflicts, thousands of year-old religions, aristocracies, but the 20th century's order isn't sustainable either. The developed world achieved a wealth that was completely unimaginable to any society before. Most lived in a utopia without real crime, disease, filth, poverty, or war. With all of that, they were still miserable. More so than even before, actually. The technological project worked only to realize that it was all a lie. Life had to mean more than the physical world and material things. At the same time, morals, the birth rate, art, culture, and the rest collapsed. The world we stare down is one where the technological project has burned social institutions to the point where most people feel empty and numb. In the process, the family, the nation, community, religion, morality, art, philosophy have been lost. So much of their societies are depressed to the point of committing suicide. The idea of the humanist wars of religion from which I made this video comes from Yuval Noah Harari's book Sapiens, and he talks about how we are the only age in history to live without a story, and that the liberal story defeated the others in the humanist wars of religion, but now we don't believe that anymore, and so we just sit in complete shock, unable to process the world. Did any of you notice earlier in the video where I talked about what things each of the humanist ideologies needed to balance themselves out to be successful? And for each of them in their own separate ways, it was that they needed to actually be a religion rather than an ideology. This is because the technological project puts too much weight on human ability, which humans are just incapable of building a utopia, and they need grounding from something greater than merely human initiative. The lives my generation face are the opposite of those of the technological revolution. It will see incredibly rapid population collapse, the degeneration of social structure in a world of less every year rather than more. In this world, the technological scheme will seem like a bitter joke from a lost time. In an age of decline, inequality, and the need to boost the birth rate, things the rest of history understand very well, religion, whether of old or new varieties, will suddenly look much more appealing. You know, the Old Testament was right. The story of the world is mankind leaving God when it's doing well and then begging to have him back when things get worse every time.